Hello students. In my previous video, I have explained you poem An Elementary School Classroom in a Slum written by Steven Spender. Today I am going to explain you figures of speech of this poem. Far, far from gusty waves, these children's faces. Here, the figure of speech is repetition because the word far is repeated for poetic effect. Another figure of speech here is alliteration because the sound of the consonant F is repeated in the words far, from and faces. Another figure of speech here is synecdoche because the part of the body faces stands for the children. Next is like rootless weeds, the hair turn round their paler. Here the figure of speech is simile because there is direct comparison between the hair of the children and rootless weeds. The point of comparison is being dry and withered. Next is the tall girl with her weighed down head. Here the figure of speech is synecdoche because the part of body head stands for the girl. Another figure of speech here is alliteration because the sound of the consonant W is repeated in the words weight and with and the sound of H in her and head. Another figure of speech here is transferred epithet because the adjective weighed down has been transferred from the girl to her head with which she is related. Next is the paper-seeming boy with rat's eyes. Here the figure of speech is metaphor because there is indirect comparison between paper and boy. He is thin and lightweight like paper. There is also comparison between the eyes of the boy and a rat. They are very bulging. Another figure of speech here is hyperbole because there is an overstatement that the boy seems to be thin like paper. Next is the stunted, unlucky year of twisted bones reciting a father's gnarled disease his lesson from his desk. Here the figure of speech is tautology because here the words stunted, twisted bones and gnarled disease are used which have the same meaning. Next is at back of the dim class one unnoted, sweet and young. Here the figure of speech is metonymy because the word unnoted, sweet and young represent the boy sitting at the end of the class. Next is his eyes live in a dream of Squirrels Game in tree room other than this. Here the figure of speech is metaphor because the boy dreams of playing games like a squirrel does and the dreams that the class is like a tree room. Another figure of speech here is synecdoche because part eyes stands for the boy on the last seat. Next is on sour cream walls donations. Here the figure of speech is metaphor because the walls are compared with sour cream color. Next is Shakespeare's Head, cloudless at dawn, civilized dome riding all cities. Here the figure of speech is metonymy because the word Shakespeare's Head, civilized dome and cities represent a civilized society. Next is belled, flowery, terrace valley. Here the figure of speech is internal rhyme because the rhyming words flowery and valley are used in the same sentence for poetic effect. Next is open-handed map awarding the world its world. Here the figure of speech is repetition because the word world is repeated for poetic effect. Next is and yet for these children, these windows, not this map, their world. Here the figure of speech is litotes because the negation is used to convey the positive meaning that the map on the wall hardly shows their world. Next is where all their futures painted with a fog. Here the figure of speech is metaphor because the future of the slum children appears like a fog, dim and clouded. Another figure of speech here is alliteration because the sound of consonant F is repeated in the words fog and future. Another figure of speech here is hyperbole because there is an overstatement that their future is painted with a fog. Next is a narrow street sealed in with a lead sky. Here the figure of speech is metaphor because the sky is compared with lead. The point of comparison is dull and sad. Next is far, far from rivers, capes and stars of words. Here the figure of speech is repetition because the word far is repeated for poetic effect. Another figure of speech here is paradox because an absurd statement but has a deep hidden meaning that rivers and capes are words like stars unreachable to the slum children who live in filth. Next is surely Shakespeare's is wigged, the map a bad example. Here the figure of speech is paradox because an absurd statement but has a deep hidden meaning that Shakespeare and the maps of the civilized world make no sense or are useless to the slum children. Next is with ships and sun and love tempting them to steal. Here the figure of speech is personification because inanimate ships and sun are given the human quality of tempting. Another figure of speech here is metonymy because the words ships and suns represents the civilized world of the haves. Next is for lives that slyly turn in their crumped holes from fog to endless night. Here the figure of speech is alliteration because the sound of consonant F is repeated in the words for, from and fog. Another figure of speech here is rhetoric because a question is asked not for the sake of an answer but for poetic effect. Another figure of speech here is metonymy because the words crumped holes represents the homes in the slums and fog to endless night represents sad conditions. Another figure of speech here is personification because inanimate lives are given the human quality of being sly. Next is on their slag heap these children wear skins peeped through by bones and spectacles of steel with mended glass like bottle bits on stones. Here the figure of speech is alliteration because the sound of consonant ST is repeated in the words steel and stones and sound of B in by, bones, bottle and bits. Another figure of speech here is metaphor because there is direct comparison between the slum and slag. The point of comparison is to be dirty and depressing. Another figure of speech here is simile because there is direct comparison between the glass in the spectacles of the children and broken bottle bits. The point of comparison is to be crude. Another figure of speech here is paradox because an absurd statement but has a deep hidden meaning that the slum children are so undernourished that it looks like their bones are peeped through their skin. Next is all of their time and space are foggy slum. Here the figure of speech is paradox because an absurd statement but has a deep hidden meaning. The slum children will pass their entire life and time in the dark slum. Next is so blot their maps with slums as big as doom. Here the figure of speech is alliteration because the sound of consonant B is repeated in the words blot and big. Another figure of speech here is simile because there is direct comparison between the slum life of the children and doom. The point of comparison is to be never ending and miserable. Next is Unless governor, inspector, visitor, this map becomes their window. Here, the figure of speech is internal rhyme because rhyming words governor, inspector, and visitor are used for poetic effect. Next is, and these windows that shut upon their lives like catacombs. Here, the figure of speech is simile because there is direct comparison between tunnels and the lives of the children in the slums. Point of comparison is to be narrow and tomb-like. Next is break, oh break, open till they break the town. Here the figure of speech is repetition because the word break is repeated for poetic effect. Another figure of speech here is exclamation because an exclamatory form is used for poetic effect. Next is and show the children to green fields. Here the figure of speech is metonymy because the green fields represent unpolluted nature. Next is and make their world run azure on gold sands. Here the figure of speech is metonymy because the azure on gold sands represents unpolluted seas and beaches. Another figure of speech here is personification because inanimate world is given the human quality of running. Next is and let their tongues run naked into books and white and green leaves open history theirs whose language is the sun. Here the figure of speech is synecdoche because part tongue stands for the slum children. Another figure of speech here is personification because inanimate nature and sun are given the human quality of teaching. Another figure of speech here is metonymy because run naked represents freedom. Another figure of speech here is hyperbole because there is an overstatement that their language is the sun. I hope you have understood the poem and the figures of speech of this poem. Your homework is answer the following questions.
Thank you.